Her book, thrilling to her only minutes before, was now lying face down on the covers, exactly the way her Aunt Hannah told her not to leave it. "You'll ruin the spine," she said more times than Gabby cared. "Treat a spine of a book as you would any vertebrate." She always said this with a smile, but it didn't change the fact that she was trying to teach Gabby a lesson. Gabby wasn't much for lessons, for school, for informative anecdotes, witty truisms, or anything that didn't involve a plan to get her back home to her own bed, her own books, her own stuff, and her parents. Aunt Hannah and Gabby's grandmother Eugenie had a litany of sayings that Gabby and Raphael, her brother 4 years younger but 10 times more annoying, always seemed to be canting. "Manners go a long way. No one likes a smart aleck. When walking in the bush, wear good boots and carry a big stick. Wash your hands whenever you hold a reptile. Their skin carries bacteria. Never, never leave a cage, gate or mouth open." Gabby had been living at the edge of the bush in Kites Creek now with Raphi for 6 months. The first 3 had been something of a blur of new beds and strange smells, different food and the relentless passage of mammals and invertebrates that inhabit nearly every room inside and out of Eugenie Myrtle's animal sanctuary. "Welcome to the Ark Park," Eugenie would say brightly to the visitors who traipsed through their place on the weekends. Weekdays, the sanctuary was the family's private home and the refuge of every needy animal in the vicinity. But on weekends, Eugenie and Hannah would open the gates and their doors to locals and travellers keen to grab a peek at pinkies in pouches and the vast menagerie of injured, sick or orphaned creatures who called the sanctuary home. Eugenie relied on the donations she elicited from visitors to pay for the sizable food and heating bill a volunteer animal shelter incurred. She was a natural storyteller, and her captivating and more often heartbreaking tales of animal survival was usually enough to open the purse strings of the human traffic they accommodated. Eugenie was gifted at ways and means of soliciting donations from the hardest of hearts to maintain the animals' welfare. But in the last few years, the energy bills had skyrocketed. The feed bill was rising faster than a thermometer's mercury on a scorcher, and now the land surrounding the sanctuary was being snapped up at auctions every weekend, systematically changing the neighbourhood from scrubby, undesirable bush blocks into green-hedged quarter acres of new housing developments. Gabby often heard her aunt and grandmother discussing this very subject at night around the kitchen table when they thought she was asleep. She'd creep downstairs and sit on the landing by the swing door that led into the stretched rectangle of a dining room, where they prepared unction for animals and as often fed them as well. Gabby didn't understand all the words used by her elders, but she was bright enough to appreciate the seriousness of their meaning. "We could have bought the lot, lock and stock, when we first moved here," Eugenie had a habit of saying, "but Lorcan wouldn't budge. Why would we buy more land when we can have it for free?" Gabby knew Eugenie was referring to her late husband, Gabby's long-dead grandfather, whom she'd never known. Lorcan Myrtle was, according to the locals, a man's man, a no-nonsense individual probably rolling in his grave to see his home turned over to the public on weekends. What the locals and her grandmother were referring to was how the sanctuary had turned from Lorcan's private hideaway into a very public venture soon after he was dead and buried. From her tales and snippets of conversation, Gabby figured out Lorcan Myrtle was a recluse and a botanist who had abandoned a teaching career to follow his passion to live a self-sufficient lifestyle. "Off the grid and out of harm's way," Eugenie often mimicked these words of Lorcan's. "Only problem was his offspring didn't see it that way," Eugenie always added. As Lorcan and Eugenie had got older, working the land to provide for the family became a much harder gambit, and their only son, Neil, Gabby's father, didn't care for such an isolated lifestyle. Neil wanted to travel and took off overseas as soon as he finished the homeschooling Eugenie had made him endure. After that, the self-sufficient lifestyle of Eugenie and Lorcan Myrtle began to telescope backwards until even Lorcan had to admit they would starve if he didn't take some drastic measures. That was when he began to sell off his land. "And that's what broke him," Gabby heard Eugenie say on more than one occasion. "And tuppence we got too," she'd add.